to switch to. I need to switch to the right monitor. Here we go. All right. So my name is Matthias Wolnick. I'm a senior program manager, and I work in the file server team. So today I'm going to talk to you about data classification, talk about how to use classification for purposes such as compliance and access control. So we're going to try and focus here a little bit on the platform, what kind of scenarios it enables, and we're going to talk about how it can be extended by ISVs and what some of our partners have done to do so. And, well, let's just get started. So we've talked about data management many times from the Microsoft side over the years, and the challenges that we see really haven't changed over the last few years. Realistically, we have organizations getting more and more people working for them and producing mass quantities of data. And the amount of data that they're producing per person keeps growing and growing for the organization. To make matters worse, the people are distributed throughout the world, which introduces a bunch of, well, regulatory issues. Data that's produced in Europe, if it contains personal information, can't be exported easily, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, businesses have their own governance, risk, and compliance rules that they have to deal with to make sure that their data is maintained and kept secret, et cetera, et cetera. And on top of that, well, the budget that we have to make all that happen keeps getting smaller because, the economies in the world aren't doing so well these days. Taking all that together, and we have a real problem dealing with data that an organization produces. Now, if you look at the role of the file server and all that, that's where a lot of the data that we produce actually ends up in. About 80% of the data that we produce ends up on a file server somewhere. And usually you have one person who's responsible for that, or maybe a small handful of people who's responsible for that file server. Yet the data that's being put on that server is usually produced by a very large number of people who, have completely different priorities than the file server admin does. When the admin is asked to, say, create a new project share, easy, new share is created, done. But as the admin is asked to create new policies, make sure that corporate IP doesn't leak out, that the patentable stuff needs to be kept separate to make sure that we can protect it correctly. What happens is that shares get more and more complicated. The layout that that the admin creates to ensure that he stays compliant, that he's being told to do, gets more and more complicated for him to do. After a while, you end up with something that looks a lot like this. A great layout from an admin's point of view in that everything is controlled based on what he's being told he has to do. But from a user's point of view, well, now he doesn't have any clue which of the 50 folders he can actually put his data into. So what happens? The user puts the data onto his desktop, and that's pretty much it, or wherever it happens to be most convenient. It no longer matters to the user really what the compliance is, but rather where it makes his job easier. That's not a good thing. From an organizational point of view, we just introduced a huge amount of risk. So what we said at Microsoft is we need to change this. On a file server, we really need to manage data differently. We need to manage data based on the value of the data to the organization, not based on where it's stored. Where it's stored should be completely unimportant. To do that, we need to first, classify the data, label it, figure out some way of describing that data, and then base our policy on that information instead of basing on where the data is stored. Now, how do you classify data? It's kind of a fundamental, important piece for this whole thing. Well, really, there's four main ways of classifying data. You can classify based on location. The concept of having a project share is still very valid, right? A project is unreleased. It's financial information that's being gathered right now for the next forecast. We can mark that project share as, internal only. So location-based classification is still valid. Manual classification, user can easily say, I just create a file that contains the credit card information for our customers from the last 2 months. I know that thing has to be kept secret because of, credit card compliance. But in the end, when you have a file server, you deal with lots of people, and they aren't always as educated enough to be able to effectively manually classify files. So we need to automatically classify files as well. We need to be able to say data that contains credit card information must be marked as to be encrypted or must be marked as PCI compliance. And of course, line of business applications, when they create data, they oftentimes know a lot about that data, and they can say, this data should be marked as something. Now, what we did as a result in 2008 R2 is we created something called the file classification infrastructure. Really, that was the idea behind it was to allow organizations and companies to build applications that leverage this concept of classifying files and then applying some policy to it. Now, so what we have here on the slide actually is the pipeline, what we call the pipeline, that we created for FCI to discover data, classify it, and save that information, and then apply some policy to it. Now, this thing had a nice API extensibility layer for partners in various ways to make this a complete solution. And we had the beginning of a solution in the platform, but only a beginning. Now, going forward, we took all the feedback we'd gotten from our customers and from our partners and said, okay, we know we have to do more. We have to do even better, because there's certain things that were obvious, clear requirements from our customers and our partners' customers that we need to address. And so everything that's highlighted here are areas that we significantly improved in Windows Server 8 to allow even more comprehensive scenarios to be implemented. In the meantime, we did not change our APIs. We did not remove them, completely redo them. A lot of the existing things I'll show you today were built using the API documentation from Server 2008 R2 that are now in more places on the platform. For example, certain APIs now exist on the client side. Certain other APIs have been made available to non-API admins, et cetera, et cetera. So we've enhanced the platform. We haven't tried to rebuild it. So what did we do in Windows 8? So first thing we did is, as part of our deployment of Windows Server 2008 R2, we spent a lot of time hearing the most common problem with classification is, so how do I label my data? What properties do I want to track for my files? And we said, well, we don't know really. It depends on what your regulations are, what you care about, et cetera. So as a result, we spun up a program inside Microsoft to create something that we call the Data Classification Toolkit for Server 2008 R2, which introduced as part of it a harmonized taxonomy. We basically went and analyzed some of the most common governance documents and said, what information would we have to track to allow someone to be compliant to this document? And we came up with a harmonized taxonomy based on that information. Now, this is a starting point. This is not the end point. There are many things that can be done and should be done to maintain compliance outside of just this, but this is a starting point that can be built off of. Now, taking that information that we'd learned for the Data Classification Toolkit, we said, why make people download an extra piece for Windows Server 8? Well, just have that as part of the platform and allow people to enable the pieces that they need. So we actually included these property definitions in the platform, and just all you have to do is say, I need that property, and it'll be available to the organization. So this gives an organization a very easy way to deploy from nothing to a reasonable set of policies in a very quick manner. The other thing we heard is that when we define a taxonomy for an organization, we don't want to go from server to server to server and say, here are the properties that we want to use, here are the properties we want to use. Instead, I want one place where I can say, these are the properties I care about for my organization, and let that spread out to my machines. So what we did is we allow you to now define the properties in Active Directory. And any Windows 8 file server, as well as any Windows 8 client, can now go and learn about what the taxonomy is that the organization wants to use to describe its data. Now you'll notice a little picture diagram up in the top right corner, the green one. You notice a little highlight in the middle there? That's basically showing you the area of the pipeline that we improved. This is the classification. How do we classify files? The other thing that we learned is manual classification requires education, but is an important piece for most organizations. So we didn't really have a good story for that in 2008 R2. So in Windows 8, in Windows Server 8, we actually introduced the ability to manually classify files simply in the Explorer window. Right-click Properties, and you can actually use the properties that have been defined in the organization to identify files. In addition to that, of course, we've also made it possible to specify the properties for a folder, so that files that get added to the folder automatically get classified as well. Automatic classification. We've always had some in-box classification capabilities based on content, simple things. You could specify search terms. And third parties could come in and build more complicated classification mechanisms. Now, one of the big limitations we had in 2008 R2 is the simple fact that classification had to happen on a scheduled basis. Building classification that does not affect the file server is a difficult problem. So what we chose to do in Server 2008 R2 is to slow things down a bit, as in run classification during off hours. So you could say, I don't need as much of my processing power from, say, midnight to 5 a.m. I can afford a little bit of a hit. Not too much, but a little bit. Now, in Windows Server 8, we actually changed around and worked on the time between data creation and data classification to minimize that, so that now we actually continuously classify files and data as it gets created and as it gets updated. And of course, applications still have to be able to classify files, so we still have the full API, so applications can do this. Now, the API that we expose here is remotely scriptable COM API. So it's accessible from C++, C#, PowerShell, et cetera, et cetera. Now, let's talk about how we classify data. So we exposed the file classification infrastructure. No? Right. Really need to pull that over. Oh, tell me it didn't make it smaller. Oh, I apologize. The resolution didn't get set correctly after all. I could have sworn it was, but it didn't. All right, we'll work around it. It'll be okay. Here, problem solved. Here, see, you can see everything. All right, so we've always exposed the user interface of the file classification infrastructure through the File Server Resource Manager. It's a component that's been around since Server 2003 R2 to deal with quotas, file screens, figure out, do storage reporting, figure out what's on your server, and control the type and quantity of it, which was a very natural fit to enable classification and policies in general. So what we can do very simply on the file server is we can go into classification properties, and we can say, let's define a property. And all you have to do is you can right-click, create property, well, create local property, and we can specify a name for a property, anything we really feel like, say C, and pick a type. Now, the types that we support are a strict subset of the types that SharePoint supports. They're relatively simple things, strings, integers, yes, no values. But a few of them are a little more complicated, such as the ordered list, where you can specify a series of values that the property can have, but there's an implicit ordering between the different values in the list. Now, creating a local property is great, but as we said, we want to be able to do this globally. So what we can do is we can actually go to the domain controller, which is currently on my other monitor. And here what we can do now is we can go and see the resource properties that are defined in the organization. Now, in this case, I've actually enabled one of the predefined properties that I showed you earlier, the impact property. Now, the impact property, for example, is an ordered list property, just as before, with values of low, moderate, and high. Creating a property here is pretty much the same thing as a moment ago, right? All we have to do is say new resource property. We'll give it a type. If I can type, there we go. And a type of a name and a type. We'll make this one a yes, no, for example. And then we have one thing we need to choose. And that is one of the most common questions that came up during 2008 R2 is, how do I base security on resource properties? And in the past, our answer has always been, well, you really can't. It requires all kinds of special handling of properties, et cetera. So now one of the things we've said is, do you want to use this property for security purposes or not? If so, well, we need to say during the definition that this is something we're going to use for security. And if it's going to be something that we use for security, it's something that you have to define in Active Directory. Locally defined properties we don't want to use for security. It causes all kinds of problems. So now, once I've created properties in Active Directory, these properties are accessible to me on the file server. So here we see the impact property has come down from Active Directory down, and of course with all the same settings as before. Now what I can do is I can go to a share, and for example, I can right-click on the share itself, say HR share here. We'll scroll up just a bit so you can see the title a bit better. And I now have a classification tab. And here now you can see the impact property is available for this share. Now in general, for this folder. In general, for folders, the only properties that you can set in a folder are properties that are marked as for security. It has one very important effect. If I say, for example, that all files in this in this folder should be impact equals moderate, and then go and look at the actual files, here you'll see the impact equals moderate was pushed down. Effectively, I've marked the location and said this thing, moderate impact. Everything inside it must be marked as moderate impact at a minimum by default. Now on the file, you also see the property that we created locally, the PII property, that was a non-secure property that I could be setting as well. Now let's set this one to high. Okay. Now, so we've classified files. This is good. What's the effect of that, though? And it's a experience that works. Is it ideal? Does it fit well into workflows? Sort of. It's a little complicated to explain. But, as I said, everything that we're talking about here is a platform that people can build up on top of. So one of the partners that we have built a better experience around classification. And let's actually reload this. I should be able to see it. And if I did everything right. Yes, there we go. Right. So Titus Labs is one of the partners that we've worked with in the past and that has worked with us now to give us a better experience for classification. So now what they've done is they've actually exposed the impact property as part of the context menu of the file to make it easier from a user's point of view to see what properties are important to the organization and easy to classify files without going through multiple levels of dialogues. What it really means, though, is the experience that we provide is one experience for manual classification. But applications, third parties can create much more complex or more streamlined experiences for the same kind of classification. Now, one other thing that they did, which I seem to have broken just before I started the demo, which is very sad, is they built a great little capability to put overlays on icons. And I think I can actually simulate. Let's see here. I may have broken it by accident. Let's put one in and see if it works. Here we go. We do have overlays. There we go. So they can actually add the ability into Explorer to put little icons onto our files to visually indicate to our end users, saying, this is an important file, and this is not, or this is a file you have to be careful about. And then, of course, how these icons are generated, which files they're on, which the classification of a file needs to be for an specific icon to be assigned to it, is all configurable as well. So this allows us to have a simple glance at the files in a folder and say, look, this is important, and this is not. These are kind of experiences that can be created on top of the manual classification capabilities that we already have. Now, we talked about manual classification, but important, we cited earlier, is automatic classification. It's a very important capability. So what we can do, as in the file server, is we can define a series of classification rules. So for example, here we have a classification rule that says find confidential files. Hopefully people can read it. And every classification rule has a scope. These are the files, these are the folders that I'm going to run on, that I'm going to actually take effect on. And in this case, we'll see it's the HR share. Now, every classification rule uses a classification plugin. In the box, we have two classification plugins, the folder classifier and the content classifier. Now, the folder classifier is a way for an admin, and only an admin, to go in and say everything in this folder must meet a minimum bar, right? It must have a minimum level of classification assigned to it. It's a more forceful way of doing a location-based classification that we had available in 2008 R2 as well. Now, the content classifier cracks open files using the same mechanisms that the search indexer uses, an ifilter, and looks through those files for, in this case, the string confidential. And of course, you could also specify a regular expression, a case-sensitive string. And if it finds that string, then in this case, the rule will apply the impact property to have the value high for that file. So now if I go back to my share, and I take my super huge Word file here, which says very much data, but for demonstration purposes, makes sense. I can take that file, and I can copy it into that share. Now, on this server, I have enabled continuous classification. So you saw that that file suddenly jumped from 2 kilobytes to 3 kilobytes shortly after I've created the data on the server. That's because the file server went in, it first assigned moderate impact to it because of location, and then did automatic classification, saw the word confidential, and assigned high impact to that classification instead. So as soon as data shows up, the file classification infrastructure can go in and identify important data, identify personal data, whatever it may be, based on automatic classification rules to classify that data for further processing. Now, the in-box classification mechanisms are good, but they require a lot of effort from an organization to determine what do we search for? How do I figure out that this is important data to my organization? So what we did is we made how to classify files extensible. So today we have, I'm going to enable. We have a partner here today with us, WebSense. WebSense is a company that has built some very sophisticated technology to classify data and to apply data leakage prevention technology on top of that. And so what they have done is they've actually created a plugin into FCI that utilizes their policy engine. To classify data based on their various policies that they have defined. So in this case, we have a identify PII rule here that once again has the same scope, HR shares, and uses the WebSense classifier. This was earlier not in the list. I just enabled it because otherwise there wouldn't be a very good demo. Now in this case, the WebSense classifier will assign the PII property that we created earlier. Now, this is a local property, but it could just as well be a global property, and assigns yes to it if, in this case, the WebSense policy personal identifiable information is met. In other words, if the WebSense policy to identify PII is met, then that file should be marked as PII. Now, in this case, I've actually restricted it further and said only watch if the region of that PII, if it's Australian PII. The various policies that WebSense includes are various regions around the world. So they have a lot of interesting capability that I don't, as an administrator, don't have to know how it works. But from an extensibility point, it is a great technology for somebody to take, to implement, and to allow them to become compliant and to classify their files very simply based on something that they know they can trust. Now, if I did this correctly, now here we have a file with an Australian TFN. I'm not sure exactly what TFN stands for. I do know it's Australian PII, so that's good enough for me right now. There we go. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So I can take that file. I should be able to copy it over to my server, into my share that is classified. And if I type things in just before, sadly I was typing in things just before, it should say PII equals yes. It identified the tax file number based on various algorithms, which in this case, in most of those social security numbers, et cetera, those aren't usually just simple patterns. There's usually an algorithm involved as well that needs to be evaluated to ensure that it actually is really something that is PII, not just a random part number, for example. So we've actually enabled the integration of a strong classification engine into FCI that any application can take advantage of that also uses FCI as its basis. So today we have a number of partners here who all develop plugins that are extensions to FCI where none of them knew about each other ahead of time. Yet they all worked together because they all worked against the common interface that FCI provided to enable classification and policies at the end. Now, back to the PPT. Okay. So what we've shown you here as one partner is the capability for WebSense that has the capability to classify files or classify data in general based on many, many different kind of patterns and algorithms, the ability to plug that into something like the FCI infrastructure to classify files based on not just location and content, but something complicated and actually is applicable to various parts of the geography in the world. Of course, it's customizable and all those things. And of course, they have the ability to extend what interfaces they use to configure these things as well. So you don't have to necessarily do the things that we're showing here. So a classifier has the ability to have a much more useful user interface as well. Oh, wrong button. There we go. And what they're actually doing is they have the FCI. FCI provides what we call a pipeline plugin, which basically all it is it receives FCI decides which files need to be classified based on various heuristics to make sure that we only classify files that need to be classified. FCI then sends the metadata about the file name, file owner, size, all that kind of good stuff, to the various plugins, including the WebSense plugin, and gives it also a stream of contents. What is the contents of the data? And says, I want to know about, in this case, the PII property. What should I put and what value should I put in the PII property? And the plugin can then go and make a decision. In this case, what they do is they go out to and then take that information, pass it to their classification engine that's run as a separate process, bring it back and tell FCI this file should be marked as PII or not. And FCI goes along and aggregates the information from various plugins into one value that it then saves on the file server for that file. Now, when it comes to information governance, we find in general that there's about, well, there's not that many policies that we want to apply. 4 here to determine who has access to information, audit access to information, encrypt information, and applying appropriate retention are probably the most common policies that we apply to data for information governance. When we look at what we actually do in terms of FCI itself, for policy, we have something in the box called a file management task. File management task is a simple concept really of saying certain files match the criteria, such as are older than certain date, have certain classification properties set to specific values, etc. And then those files need to have some action happen to them. In the box, the one we had in 2002 was the concept of file expiration, taking data and moving it into the control of the administrator away from the control of the user. What we've done now is we've said, well, this is good, but just like classification in 2002, this was a scheduled process. So once a week, once a day, once a month, we would go out and get rid of files, right? Or run whatever custom action you had told the file management task to please run. And for many situations, that's good enough. You only need to worry about expiration maybe once a month. But there are certain things that need to happen quickly after we identified a file that meets the specific requirement. What we did, therefore, is we, just like with classification, we made file management tasks available to run continuously. So as data gets created, as data gets modified or classified, we can immediately take action on that file to make sure we meet the requirements of the policy. The other thing we kept getting asked about is, why can't we encrypt files easily? Well, so we said, well, we need to be able to encrypt files. That's the obvious solution. So what we did is we integrated RMS encryption into a file management task as a default inbox policy right alongside the expiration capability. And of course, once again, we can do this continuously. What does that mean? That means we can take a file, identify that it contains, say, a credit card number, and encrypt it shortly after it was created on the file server using the RMS infrastructure and FCI. Now, the other side, we alluded to earlier, we talked about security. And if you were here in this room, I believe at 9:30 this morning, you got to hear all about this great concept of dynamic access. Well, the concept here really is that you want to be able, there are certain types of access controls that are a little bit more complicated than what we have been able to do in the past. One of the things that we've always lacked is to be able to create an access policy such as people can only access data that is part of the same department that they work in. So if you have a guy from finance, he shouldn't be able to access the information that HR has, and the other way around. If that guy from finance moves to HR, well, he should lose his access to finance documents and gain the access to HR documents. To do that kind of policy, we have to be able to, well, identify information about files. This is where FCI comes in. FCI allows us to give information about the file, which can then be used in a central access policy to determine who has access to this information and who does not have access to this information, based on information about them and potentially about their machine and the file they're trying to access. So let's look at a demo. Because demos are always more fun to see, even if they don't always work. It's at least amusing to laugh at the poor guy who's trying to do the demo. Come on, VGA. Hello. Okay. It's not showing. Ah, here we go. Something's happening. Oh, come on, really? How about duplicate? Oh, and just as I hit duplicate, it comes on. Well, you know, I suppose it'll work. Ooh. All right. Sorry. A little squished. Just a little bit. We'll make it work. All right. So one of the basic things we want to talk about, right, is encryption. This is an important concept because it comes up in most organizations at some point. And so what I have here is I have a file management task. Now this file management task I've called encrypt high impact data. Just like a classification rule, a file management task has a scope. It only affects files in certain areas. You don't necessarily want to encrypt all the files, a bunch of files in your R&D project, but maybe you want to encrypt all kinds of files in your finance share, or maybe the other way around. We didn't want to force everything to be under the scope of this file management task. So you can specify what should be protected. Now the action that we're going to take, in this case, is RMS encryption. Now, as you can see, in the ones that are available are file expiration, like I said earlier, custom, which basically means you will run whatever command you tell us to run for the files that match the criteria, and RMS. Now, for the RMS capability, you can select a predefined template if you want. So up here, you can actually see the Contoso Finance admin-only template. Or if it's something that it needs to be more specific, you can create an ad hoc template for the share, for example. So what I've done here is I've actually created a template that says everyone has read control, just principally everyone. And I've also checked the box at the very bottom saying add folder to the folder owner to the full control list. Now, if you've seen the share creation wizard that we have now, it shows you the capability actually to specify the folder owner of a file, of a folder owner of a share. What that means is you can say a series of people are the people who actually own the data here. They know what kind of data is in here. For the file server admin, he has no clue, but these people should know. That means those are people that we can go to ask questions about, that we can go request access from, and that we can make sure that they will have access to the data if it's encrypted, even if the original owner has left the company, for example. And of course, we don't want to encrypt everything. We only want to encrypt some things. And what I've done here is I've created a condition that says the impact property has to be high. So only high impact files should be encrypted, nothing else. Now, we could have gone further, but there are some restrictions. One restriction is that for this specific file, let me say this for me. For this specific file management task, we've created a schedule to run monthly. But more importantly, I've said this task must run continuously, as in it must execute as soon as we identify a high impact file. It should be encrypted. Now, there is a limitation. If you have a continuously running file management task that's picking files, and if you then told me this must also find any files that are at least 365 days old, then that would mean I have to track the age of every single file in your system continuously. And the second it gets to that age, it might have to go in part of the file management task. That'll slow down your machine. We don't want that. So as a result, we don't allow you to specify conditions for creation, modification time, etc., if the file management task is continuous. Now, let's see what this actually means. Does it actually work? I'll prove it at least a little bit, right? So from a scope point of view, this was HR share protect. So we can take that employee case file that we had earlier, and I can copy it over. And if I did things correctly, I didn't screw things up just beforehand. Aha, we see the 2 kilobyte file immediately went up to 126 kilobytes, and WordPad can no longer open it. Well, it's because I don't have Word installed in this file server. If I did, it would ask me for credentials next, because this file has now been encrypted. Now, we're using RMS here. That means the RMS ecosystem that exists also exists here. We're using the standard RMS protector interfaces that RMS has provided for a very long period of time. And we have in the box, we have protectors for Office files included. So these are standard. If you install Office, you get Office protectors. We've included them here in the box. That also means that third parties can come in and extend the interfaces. Now, another one of our partners, GigaTrust, has come in and taken their protectors and made them available for us as well, and made them available as a plugin for the RMS infrastructure. So now what I can do is I can install their plugins. Let's make sure I did that right. Okay, it does work. And I can now go in, and for example, I already have a few files on here. I can go in and run this file management task. We'll wait for it to complete. And we'll get a nice little report. And the big advantage here is that GigaTrust has taken it a step further. Not only do they allow you to encrypt Office files, they also allow you to encrypt, wait for it, come on, IE, on the Slovia. More importantly, they've also allowed you to encrypt PDF files. So the protectors that GigaTrust has produced are compatible if I did things right. Did I not mark it as? Watch, I didn't mark it as high impact, did I? As part of my demo, did I? That would be sad. Of course it didn't protect the file because I didn't mark it as high impact. Now I should do that. We should run this again because I wanted to show the report as part of this. Yeah. So what they can do is they can encrypt more file types, not just Office files. They can encrypt PDF files and various things that their tools can do now. So now we can see one file was processed, and that one file, of course, is our PDF file. And if we go back to the Explorer, we can see it increased drastically. Now, let's do the same thing. Take it a step further, because I should have done this as well at the same time. That was a silly thing of me to do. I like doing this, but I apologize. But they've taken even a step further. I just realized I missed part of the demo, but that's okay. So the next thing I will talk about after the encryption is the part of central access policies. I wanted to show you guys central access policies a little bit because I think it's a very exciting way of restricting who has access to my data, throughout an organization to provide safety net policies effectively. So let's go to my domain controller. On the domain controller, here we have central access policies. Now, I've defined some central access policies ahead of time, and since we're talking about an HR share, I have an HR policy, which I've previously said the HR share must abide by. Now, if I look at the HR policy, it's actually empty. There's nothing in there. That's not a very exciting policy. But what I can do is I can add a central access rule. Now, I've defined a few ahead of time, and here I have this limit high impact to HR policy. It's a little contrived, but it's a good policy. And what we've said in here is something very simple. This policy applies to only resources where the impact is high, nothing else. And the permissions that go along with that policy are the administrator has access, the owner has access, and everyone else can have only read and execute access, and only then if they also happen to be part of the human resources department. No one else should have access to this data. So now, I've added the central access rule to the central access policy. I go back to my file server, and by default, well, I have to actually push that policy out. I think I can do this in PowerShell. I believe I can. And once I've done that, what will happen now is I can go to my client, which I don't have a connection to. I can go to a client machine. And now let's switch to a user who actually shouldn't have access, who isn't part of the human resources department. So let's switch to mread. Very sophisticated passwords here. Very sophisticated. Now, the mread is a finance person. He's not part of the human resources organization at all. Now, if I go to the HR share, you'll notice that it has the PII prop file we had earlier and the PDF file that was in the share. But it's missing. That works. The case notes and the employee case file. The two files that we marked as high impact earlier. At the same time, if I were to say mark the PII file as high impact, the user will not stop seeing that file. This is because we've turned on access-based enumeration on that share. So he only sees files that he actually has access to, and nothing else. So we've effectively prevented him from seeing the data that he's not allowed to see due to a safety net policy, a central access policy that we have defined in Active Directory. And that means a single entity inside the organization, a security officer, a CIO, can take definite policies that are specified by an external entity, such as a regulatory environment, translate them into a policy that he can set up once, and his file server admin no longer has to worry about how am I going to stay compliant to this thing. Instead, all he has to do is apply the HR policy to my HR share, and that's done. If the regulations change, the CSO, etc., can go in and change the policy in AD, and the policy will be updated on the file share. Now we can take this a step further. Thanks to the ability to extend RMS, we can actually go in and take this manager case file that we have here that's now RMS encrypted. GigaTrust has taken it a step further. They have taken their existing protectors to encrypt Office files and said, well, what if we married the ability for RMS protection that stays attached to a file with the concept of a central access policy that is specific to file servers? What if we effectively tie those together so that an RMS encrypted file that was protected by their protectors, that was located on a share that was subject to a central access policy? What if we made that RMS, that embedded that information so that once the RMS file left the organization, that central access policy could still be enforced on the RMS server? And that's exactly what they've done. If I take this manager case file that was encrypted with the everyone policy that we had earlier and put it on a public share, One does not have the HR policy anymore. Go back to my client. Now we see my Office file right here. It's easily accessible. It was marked high impact, but I have access to the share. Now it's currently restricted. That's expected. Credentials. Let's see. But even though I'm everyone, I'm definitely everyone, and this thing is currently encrypted to everyone who has access, I don't have read access. That's because this thing is encrypted to apply that central access policy that we defined in AD to this file, regardless of if it's still on a restricted share as before. So they've married the capabilities of AD-RMS with the central access policy to extend that further. Now, let's go back to our regular user that we had earlier. In this case, actually, the admin. Let's see. Now, of course, we can do more, right? We've identified files that are valuable. We've gone and showed you we can encrypt them. We've gone and showed you we can restrict access. And of course, we can go a step further, not just access. Central access policies can also be created as central audit policies. We can say audit all accesses to files that are impact equals high. So we can track who's been accessing this information. Or audit all accesses by non-full-time employees who are for files where impact equals high. But we can do more with these properties. Once we know about them, we can do all kinds of interesting things. So one of the things, for example, that Titus Labs has done for us, if we take this Word file that we have here, the confidential Word file, as impact equals high, you'll note that they've actually extended the manual classification experience into Word itself. They've added a nice overlay so we can see things. But take it even a step further. When we save a file inside Word that is marked as impact equals high, they automatically watermark the file. They put a big watermark in the back. They put headers and footers in. So if your organization has the requirements to watermark all files, they've actually made that possible through Word. So what we've seen is we can actually use the information in other applications, through plugins in other applications, to create policies. Take it a step further. We know a file is impact equals high. What if I want to email that file to someone? I can take that file, and I can email it, well, let's say to myself. And you'll note that they've also created, Titus Labs has also created a manual classification ability for emails in this case. So we'll send it to myself. And this is the file, and we will attach file. And the file that we will attach, actually, you know what, we shouldn't even need to insert file, we'll just copy it straight over. Employee case file. No, that's not very nice. Here. There we go, employee case file. If I hit send now, their plugin will actually go in, look at the classification that FCI put into the file, and use that information to make a policy determination. Here we go. In this case, saying you've classified this email message as moderate, but the file attached is high. Now, how can they do this? Well, the property that's saved for a file is saved in general as part of an alternate data stream. When the FCI puts a property onto a file, it creates an alternate data stream, a named stream for that file, and puts the property information into that file. Furthermore, it also has the capability of adding third-party plugins for storage mechanisms. So for example, in the box, we have a plugin for Office files. So for Office files, in addition to creating a data stream, we also push those properties into the Office file itself as Office document properties. And of course, once again, any third party can come in and create a plugin to store properties, for example, in a PDF file or in an image file or whatever other file format may exist that can store metadata. Once you've done that, once the file properties are part of the file itself, moving the file around means properties will stay attached. An alternate data stream stays attached as long as the file stays on NTFS. But once it's in the Word file, it's stuck. Now, in this case, of course, I could say hi. This file should be high. And they've actually implemented another policy to say, don't send high-impact mails outside of the company. because that would be bad, right? We don't want to get that out there. So they can actually create all kinds of interesting policies about how to protect data, how to ensure that it is handled correctly. Now, to take steps a little bit further, we've shown you that you can access the information, that you can use it for various things, but let's talk about traditional data management, traditional things that are valid and really important things in today's world still. One of our partners, Data Global, has an extensive suite of data migration tools, of hierarchical storage management tools. And one thing that they've done is they've allowed you to control and use the information, classification information on files. So one thing that you can do in Data Global, for example, is you can define, I have to log in again. You can define classification properties in the Data Global suite. Now, what this does actually is, once I push policies out, it goes and defines whatever properties I define inside Data Global's infrastructure on the Windows Server 8. But at the same time, it also defines them on Windows Server 2008-R2 and on other platforms. It extends some of the reach of FCI outside of the standard Windows servers that support this infrastructure. So in this case, we create a retention duration property, or we did create one. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed through some of this a little bit here and there. With, in this case, 3 values, 1, 5, and 10, relatively straightforward. And at the same time, they allow you to also define a series of classification rules. Now, in the same manner that we had earlier in the File Server Resource Manager, we can define classification rules to some degree here in the Data Global suite. Now, what's important there? Why is this important? Everything that we did from a configuration point in the File Server Resource Manager UI for FCI is something that can be done by third-party applications. All the configuration is available through WMI. That means anybody can control this infrastructure organizationally wide and extend what we provide in terms of organization or central control to a more rich set of capabilities. Now, in this case, they allow you to specify classification rules. Now, what can they do with this then? Once, say, we can classify data. They're not in the business of classifying data necessarily per se. They're, well, to a point. But the real meat of it here is to migrate data and evaluate what's on there. So what they've done is they've allowed you to create migration tasks, actually, to classify files and analyze files. You can also then specify migration tasks that take advantage of the classification information on files. They've gone in and basically said, well, we need to migrate files to secondary storage and to an archive, for example, if it's marked as needs to be retained for 5 years. What we need to do is we need to migrate that data to the archive that maintains data for 5 years. It's a relatively straightforward concept. But what they do effectively is centrally you can say, for my organization, anything marked as retained for 5 years, I'll go send to an archive. They go out and deploy agents to various systems and bring that data into that central archive, retaining the classification information so that we can use it later on again, and using the information that was provided by inbox classification capabilities, third parties like WebSense, effectively using the information that was provided by other components. So in this case here, we have migration based on property value. We have a migration policy. Running out of time. And we could actually, let's see if I do this right. So what we've actually said is for any files that are marked as retention duration equals 5, those are the files that need to be moved into our archive. Now, what they actually allow you to do is not just specify something as simple as migration equals 5, but rather a more complex expression. So we can have ORs, we can have ANDs, we can have grouping, all those kind of good things to come together. So they allow you a relatively complex language of how to identify files and move those into our archive. These are some of the things that can be done by partners to extend what the FCI platform provides in the box, and to extend the CBAC, the dynamic access capabilities that we're adding in Windows Server 2000 and Windows Server 8. There we go. What have I shown you? I've shown you a few things. I've shown you some more partners. I've shown you Titus Labs capabilities to to change the experience of how to manually classify files, to add overlays, to add visual experience around classification of data. And I've shown you that they can classify emails, they can make sure certain policies are applied to how data flows. Now, these are all things that can be done by partners. This is a very large ecosystem that we're talking about here. If we're looking for Data Global, right? They're really doing massive migration. They enable the whole platform to be controlled centrally for an organization. They control data flow to make sure it gets retained correctly. And they can classify files based on various other actions that they control as well. And GigaTrust takes advantage of the RMS extensibility to protect data and for more file formats than what we can do by default, and take it much further. And for that matter, to extend the capability of RMS into the central access policy. So that as data flows outside of the file server, those central access policies can still be applied, even as it flows outside of the organization itself. Now, developer opportunities. Why am I telling you all this? Lots of partner things I've shown you here. That's because really we believe FCI is a great platform that you can base some big compliance and access solutions around. This provides the basis, provides a way of communicating. We have various partners here, and they can all interact in various forms without knowing about each other, without knowing exactly what the other person does or how they do it, because we provide a nice interactive, a nice way for them to interact here. People can build new ways of classifying files. We saw WebSense build a great mechanism to take all of their existing knowledge and turn it into something that other management applications can use. Data management, right? In general, anything that's data management usually requires us to tell what should we manage. And interesting thing is, most extensions that we actually do build for Windows 8, Windows Server 8, most likely will work just fine on Server 2008 R2. To be exact, I'm not going to tell you guys to go look at the cool new SDK pieces for Windows Server 8. I'm going to tell you to look at the cool samples, et cetera, that we have for Windows Server 2008 R2, because that's what our partners used. It's the same information our partners used to build the things that we saw today. The interfaces are pretty much the same. There will be some small tweaks, I'm sure, but by and large, if it works on 2008 R2, it'll probably work on Windows 8. We can utilize the information that's defined in AD, right? The property definitions, the central access policies, all those kind of things, central audit policies that would define an Active Directory. Those are things that the platform itself utilizes, but it doesn't have to stay there. Any third party, any other data repository can take advantage of the central access policies in the same manner that the file server does and restrict data access once data flows to that repository. And in the end, yeah, that's pretty much, there's a lot of opportunities there. There are a lot of interesting things that can be done, that can be extended for the compliance area, for accessing data, for auditing data. So I want to say thank you with 30 seconds remaining, just barely. I squeezed it in a little bit more. And I hope this was made sense, and feel free to ask questions. We have a few partners actually in the room, so if you want to know something about how they did something, what they did, can it be done this way, I can probably point you to the right people and go from there. So thank you very much.